All right, folks, so now we've made it to the third practice that we're going to cover. It's called challenge the process. And what we find is the best leaders are constantly challenging things to make things better, and the vision that they have is usually around some kind of challenge that they're trying to implement. So with this, like the others, there's two commitments to challenge the process. The first one is seeking opportunities by seizing initiative, and the other is experimenting and taking risks. So we're going to talk a little bit about both and how we experiment and take risks. So take a look at this image behind me. What do you think that is? And what this is actually the first ever digital camera. This was invented by an engineer at Kodak. And what's interesting about this is I could be telling you a story as someone from Rochester, New York, about how Kodak grasped this technology and owned the market for digital photography and now is a huge enterprise that's thriving because they embraced this new technology. But the reality is, when Kodak was presented with this new technology, this is their reaction. It was filmless, and so management reaction is, that's cute, but cover it up because we're a film business, right? We make our money on film, and we don't want to go into technologies that are filmless. So that's just one example of where we didn't seize opportunities, we didn't take a risk and try new things, and here's what they ended up with. So as we think about challenging the process, I want you to think about some core things that you should do as a leader. The first thing is you want to be open. In Zen Buddhism, they have this idea of using a beginner's mind, so seeing things through new eyes. The thing I always encourage leaders to do is to get those new people in your organization to really care about their inputs and care about what their perspective is, because they sometimes are those new eyes, and they'll point things out to you that other people don't relate to or don't understand, and you can't see because you've been in the organization so long. Staying in touch means, are you getting in touch with what the end user of whatever you create is doing with it? So try to stay in touch with what the business is, your world of work, the whole environment around where you work, but also just get in touch with what your customers do with the products and the services that you provide to them. And then finally, this idea of stepping outside our boundaries. Oftentimes when we think about why we can't challenge the process, there's lots of barriers that keep us from doing that. So this whole idea about stepping outside your boundaries, what we realize is that we don't necessarily expand as much as we possibly could expand and try things out, because oftentimes we do have barriers, but we're not pushing up against those barriers enough. So what I want you to thinking about is take any challenge that you're trying to overcome in the workplace. What are some of the obstacles you're bound to experience when you're trying to fix something or correct a challenge in the workplace? Give me one of the obstacles. Janet.
Resistance.
Yeah, resistance. Dave, can I see your hand up?
Financial.
Money is always a challenge, isn't it? Annie, what do you have?
We've always done it this way before.
So that pushed it to stay with the status quo. I've heard these and some others over the years. There's lots of reasons why you can't move the needle, get things going. But if these are the things that are currently limiting you, what I wanted you to ask you is, what is your current operating picture? Where are you currently operating in this area? Because my guess would be that you're not really pushing your boundaries, right? So if you really look at the boundaries you have, I mean, you might find some of these boundaries are insurmountable. We're never going to get more funding. There's no grants, there's no money for this. So maybe some are, but then you look at these other things and you say, well, what can we do now to expand ourselves in these areas? How can we get more people on board? How can we get people to challenge the status quo? How can we create a strategy to overcome some of the resistance that people are having, right? Maybe there's a policy issue, right? What can we do to challenge that policy? So when you get your picture of all those things holding you back, and I would encourage you to do this, ask your coworkers, what are those things that are always getting in our way when we're trying to make a change? So the other thing I want you to think about is when I asked you at the beginning of the workshop to think about your best times as a leader, your personal best leadership experience, the heart of many of those personal best experiences were challenges that you faced, where you were forced to challenge the process and you reacted in good ways. So as you're thinking about this practice, don't avoid it, because it's really the heart of a lot of great leadership. So those things you want to implement in your schools and improve, a lot of times those are those future personal best leadership experiences. So here's another thing that really is daunting about challenging the process. Many of you have these visions, and when you think about these visions you want to accomplish, it's not so simple to do. But if we can think of ways to break it down and have small victories around that, so generate some small wins is one of the best ways to challenge the process. So one of the first ones is kind of that obvious thing, right? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Not a very pleasant thing to think about. But this idea of breaking it down and think of the smaller pieces. And if I have this 5-year vision, what's the thing I want to get done by the first year? And from that, what's the first thing I want to get done in the first month? And from that, the first week? And maybe the first day or the first hour. So break it down to what is that first activity you want to do to start moving this towards progress. Some of the things you're going to do are big ideas, and you want to try a smaller model of what it would look like so that you don't have to spend all the money and the resources. Always keeping it simple is important because you're going to try to bring other people into your vision and into your idea. And if it's really complex and hard to understand, very likely they're not going to grasp it and they're not going to engage with you. Do the easy stuff first. I like that because it helps us build momentum. So try to think of what are those easy things. And if I can get some easy things done and get a few boxes checked on this daunting task, now I can start making some progress. Some of us have had timeshare sales done with us. And you know the best trick of a timeshare salesman is to ask you simple questions like, do you like to take vacations? Which of these vacation spots would you like to visit? Would you like to visit any of these? What they're doing is accumulating yeses. They're getting you to say yes to things because after you say yes to a bunch of things, it becomes your opinion. And why would you want to contradict yourself and go against what you were originally saying yes to? So they get you to say a lot of yeses. So if you're trying to challenge the process, think about ways you can go from points of agreement first, and then you can get into those more contentious issues. Giving feedback along the way is obviously important, and the other thing that's important is to celebrate along the way, right? Don't celebrate the big win. Don't wait for everything to be done and you can declare victory. Think about those small accomplishments and encourage the heart and celebrate along the way. So we talked about taking risk and building models and things. So one analogy I like to use as someone who works in the maritime world is that when a ship gets damaged, it's a big difference if the ship gets damaged beneath the waterline or above the waterline. Damage below the waterline is fatal sometimes. The ship will sink. But above the waterline damage isn't so bad. So when you think about the world you're working in, what are those things that are below the waterline that you really don't want to take many risks versus those things that, yeah, if we take some damage here or if we fail, it's not going to be that big a deal. It's not going to be a huge problem for us. Oftentimes we are fearful of taking any risks, but if we really think about the consequences of trying something, it's not as dire as we think. So as we're looking at challenging the process, one interesting way to approach this is this idea of a SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis is simply an acronym, right? It's basically saying what are your strengths and weaknesses, and that's your internal strengths and weaknesses, and also what are your external opportunities and threats. That's how you do a SWOT analysis. And the two things that people tend to struggle with are those external future-oriented opportunities and threats. So with this image you see on the screen here, there's another acronym you can kind of use within SWOT to think about opportunities and threats. So essentially we use this thing called PEST. So what are the political, economic, socio-cultural, and technological things going on in those opportunity areas and in those threat areas? You hear all the time, people talking about the impact of technology on our students and our learners. Well, that can be an opportunity and it can also be a threat. But having some real discussion around that can be helpful to you. The next thing we're going to talk about is change management, which goes right in line with challenge the process. So once you've challenged the process and decide you want to implement a change, we got to think about some key things with change management. So here you have a quote from Machiavelli. It's risky to make changes, and it's hard sometimes to be that person who's promoting change. But if you really want to be a leader, that's what great leaders do. A lot of the best stuff comes from a guy named John Kotter. The thing that he's most known for, though, is these 8 steps to change management. So when you're thinking about change management, think of these 8 steps. So when you want to make a change, think of some key things within these 8 steps. You should certainly consider all the 8 steps, but obviously having a sense of urgency will help you drive your change. And along with that sense of urgency, having a guiding coalition or some people who are helping you along the way is very important. I also like to highlight that last step, which is you want to have culture embedded in whatever change you're proposing. If what you propose is counter to the culture you work in, the likelihood of sustaining that change really diminishes. So make sure that however you come up with a solution, it will be culturally acceptable to the organization you're trying to change. So that finishes this challenge the process as well as the change management piece. And remember that that's the seed of many of your future personal best leadership challenges, and it's also that inspired shared vision that you hope to have will probably involve some of this challenging the process and doing change management.